Today in the Daily Dose, European and American Imperialism. Imperialism in the slaveholding South. Following the end of the Mexican-American War in February of 1848, Mexico's defeat handed much of the west coast of North America to the United States, prompting slaveholding factions within the antebellum South to dream of spreading slavery across the continent and beyond. A year later, after the discovery of gold in California, slaveholding Southerners began moving to the territory in large numbers, bringing with them an estimated 500 to 1,500 African American slaves to work the gold fields of the high Sierras and beyond, prompting pro-slavery expansionists like Henry Weiss to wager that his home state of Virginia would make $1 billion on the sale of slaves into the territory, which was hastily made a free state on September 9, 1850. Weiss's prediction proved patently wrong when Southern slaveholders discovered a second form of slavery in the American West, including Native American captives and indebted mestizo peasants, which enslaved thousands into multiple forms of bondage or peonage in the newly acquired territories of Utah, Arizona, California, and New Mexico, employing systems of forced labor far less costly than plantation agriculture and chattel slavery. Still holding immense political sway in Washington during the years leading up to secession and war, every time Whig or Republican abolitionists attempted to outlaw peonage in the American West, Southern legislators pushed back against every attempt in the 1850s, knowing full well that any law against peonage out west would eventually point a finger at their own form of slavery in the South. Despite growing abolitionist sentiment within the northern states, Southerners held fast to their expansionist visions for the American West, supported in large part by the formidable spread of Euro-American imperialism abroad, which relied heavily on indigenous coercive labor, from the British in India to the Dutch and French in Southeast Asia, prompting slaveholding Southerners to question why slavery couldn't be a part of white imperialism. With the hope of expanding their cotton markets into China, Southern legislators argued in Congress to a southern route for the Transcontinental Railroad, pointing to a terminus in port cities in Southern California to build up their Pacific trade. Yet when Abraham Lincoln took office on March 4, 1861, Southern dreams for slavery in America collapsed in the face of untenable bloodshed during the American Civil War. British imperialism in India. While invasion and occupation of foreign lands dates back to the beginning of recorded history, the British East India Company vastly expanded its interests in India since its inception in 1600, so much so that by 1720, more than 15% of all imports into Britain came from India, including rare goods such as cotton, silks, dyes, saltpeter, and tea. Maintaining order through the employment of Indian soldiers known as sepoys, throughout the late 1700s, the British East India Company expanded its control over much of eastern India from its base in Bengal, forcing its authority over the region with a sepoy army of some 267,000 men by 1857. The company's control over the region ended that same year with the Sepoy Rebellion that would last until November 1, 1858, leading to the deaths of roughly 6,000 Europeans and some 800,000 Indians. In response, British Parliament passed the Government of India Act on August 2, 1858, ending the British East India Company while transferring governance over India to the British monarchy, leading to a period known as the British Raj. Lasting until the mid-20th century, the British Raj controlled most of India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh, dividing the continent into 13 provinces, each under the control of a British administrative officer. Known as the jewel in the crown, India's importance to Great Britain exploded during the Industrial Revolution, funneling raw materials into British factories while importing food for a growing British population, at the same time turning India into a secondary market for British goods. From a numbers standpoint, between 1765 and 1938, an estimated $45 trillion in today's currency was transferred from India to Great Britain, or approximately 15 times Britain's gross national income in 2019. While some historians have argued that Britain helped India transform itself into a modern economy, including the construction of canals, roads, and the fourth largest railway system in the world, Britain's sometimes harsh treatment of Indians combined with controversial economic policies, which forced Indians to produce crops for export to English factories instead of their own tables, leading to multiple famines that took the lives of an estimated 55 million Indians. The abuses also saw the rise of nationalistic independence movements, such as the Swadeshi movement of the late 1800s and early 1900s, which saw Indians reject British imports in favor of garden-grown foodstuffs and homemade goods. Indian nationalism came to a head after Mahatma Gandhi's return from South Africa in 1915, where he advocated for non-cooperation campaigns through civil disobedience and nonviolent protests. After Britain was saddled with massive debt caused by their fight against Nazi aggression, Britain eventually ceded power back to India in 1947, dividing the country into Pakistan for Islamic believers and India for Hindus and Sikhs, ending 89 years of British rule over the Indian subcontinent. The Monroe Doctrine. By the dawn of the 1820s, many Latin American countries had won independence from Spain and Portugal, yet Britain and the United States worried that European powers would yet again try to colonize the Western Hemisphere. While President James Monroe at first favored a joint U.S.-British resolution against future colonization, Secretary of State John Quincy Adams distrusted Britain's own colonial intentions, convincing Monroe to make a unilateral statement of U.S. policy, which he delivered to Congress on December 2, 1823. At the time of Monroe's bold message that the Western Hemisphere was off limits to European interference, the young nation lacked enough military clout at the time, which made Monroe's assertion somewhat pointless until the United States became a dominating world power. Not until the Civil War ended would the Monroe Doctrine come of age, when the U.S. government sent military and diplomatic aid to Benito Juarez in Mexico, which allowed his forces to overthrow French-supported Emperor Maximilian from the throne. Theodore Roosevelt was next to invoke the Monroe Doctrine when he used it to justify a succession of U.S. interventions in Latin America. Known as the Roosevelt Corollary, or his Big Stick policy, after Roosevelt took office in September of 1901, he intervened militarily in Central America and the Caribbean, including Nicaragua, Haiti, Cuba, and the Dominican Republic. FDR later softened Roosevelt's Big Stick policy with his Good Neighbor policy, which ushered in a period of greater cooperation between North and South American countries. But at the same time, FDR invoked the Monroe Doctrine repeatedly to intervene over affairs in a number of South and Central American countries. During the Cold War, President John F. Kennedy invoked the Monroe Doctrine during the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, followed by President Ronald Reagan, who invoked the Monroe Doctrine for U.S. interventions in El Salvador and Nicaragua. President George H.W. Bush was the last president to invoke the Monroe Doctrine, when he sanctioned a U.S.-led invasion of Panama in an effort to oust corrupt Panamanian dictator Manuel Noriega. Filibusters in Central America. Under the banner of manifest destiny and a nascent sense of white supremacy, between the Mexican-American and Civil Wars, ambitious Americans attempted repeated land grabs in Central and South America, earning the name of filibusters or filibustero in the Spanish. Among the most successful or unsuccessful, dependent upon his ultimate fate, was lawyer and newspaperman William Walker, who moved from New Orleans to Northern California, where he recruited a small band of largely failed gold miners for a planned takeover of Baja, Mexico. Sailing out of San Francisco Bay with a ragtag crew of 45 men, Walker arrived in Cabo San Lucas at the end of October 1853, capturing La Paz by early November. His ranks swelled to over 300 enthusiastic mercenaries, until his lack of leadership and his beleaguered supply chain forced his retreat towards San Diego, where he surrendered to a detachment from the U.S. Army. Acquitted by a San Francisco jury in just 8 minutes' time, a testament to the strength of public opinion in Walker's favor, a year later, Walker took advantage of a civil war in Nicaragua, capturing the city of Granada before declaring himself president of the country in October of 1855. After Walker revoked shipping magnate Cornelius Vanderbilt's right to transit Nicaragua, Vanderbilt raised a private army that was soon joined by anxious forces from Costa Rica, Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, forcing Walker from power in less than 10 months' time, only to receive a hero's welcome upon his return to the States. In 1860, Walker launched yet another filibustering or freebooting campaign, as it was commonly known, this time in Honduras, quickly drawing the ire of the British government, which still had strategically important colonies in Central America. The Royal British Navy captured Walker upon his arrival in Trujillo, turning him over to Honduran authorities, who executed him by firing squad in September of that same year, at just 36 years of age. 8 months later, upon the outbreak of the American Civil War, filibustering faded into obscurity, while the uniquely American belief in manifest destiny fizzled out by 1867, making filibustering in Central America one of the oddest overreaches in American history. French imperialism in Southeast Asia. Following decades of indigenous pushback against French colonization in Southeast Asia, France's victory over China in the Sino-French War of 1884 to 1885 handed control of Annam, Tonkin, and Cochin China to the French, which today encompasses most of modern Vietnam, while the French would later take control of Guangzhouwan in the Chinese territory, as well as part of Siam in modern-day Thailand. In Vietnam, a rising sense of nationalism led to a period of insurgency known as the CNDV movement of 1885 to 1896, which led to the massacre of some 40,000 Christian missionaries and native Christian converts. Undaunted by local uprisings, France would add Laos and Cambodia to their colonial possessions after the Franco-Siamese War of 1893. Known as French Indochina or the Indochinese Union, over their years as overlords, the French heavily exploited the region's natural resources, at the same time contributing greatly to infrastructure improvements in such areas as healthcare and education. Local resistance and nationalism continued to escalate during the First World War, reaching an even higher crescendo during the Yen Bai Mutiny of early 1930, when the Vietnamese Nationalist Party encouraged military uprisings by Vietnamese soldiers, along with clandestine guerrilla war tactics inflicted by local Vietnamese, with the aim of ousting French rule while restoring the Vietnamese monarchy to power. 10 years later, a further insurrection would occur in Cochin China, before the Japanese invasion and takeover of Southeast Asia during World War II. Upon Japan's surrender after the nuclear destruction of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a communist organization led by Ho Chi Minh declared Vietnam an independent nation, leading to the First Indochina War of 1946 between French and Viet Minh forces. As the Americans would learn firsthand during their participation in the Vietnam War, after some 2,000 years of invasions by the Chinese into Southeast Asia, the First Indochina War would see years of guerrilla-style attacks by Ho Chi Minh's forces, and after the communist governments of China and the Soviet Union supported Ho's legitimacy through weapons and monetary infusions, the war would drag on until the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, when Viet Minh forces won a decisive victory over the French in May of 1954. France's defeat would lead to the Geneva Conference that same year, which saw France cede North Vietnam to the Communists, while South Vietnam remained under the control of the Bao Dai regime backed by American support, setting the stage for 19 years of American Cold War involvement in Southeast Asia until the fall of Saigon in 1975. Early American imperialism. From the time the first settlers arrived in Virginia from England and started moving westward, writes Yale historian Paul Kennedy, this was an imperial nation, a conquering nation, while Ben Franklin wrote that hence the prince that acquires new territory, if he finds it vacant or removes the natives to give his own people room. Combined with the Indian Wars and the ethnic cleansing campaign known as Indian Removal, European American settlers embraced a policy of imperialism from the moment they set foot in North America. And while President George Washington enacted a policy of non-interventionism that lasted into the early 19th century, the Monroe Doctrine of 1823 drew a line in the sand, declaring North America off-limits to further European colonization, which in turn gave rise to the national drive of Manifest Destiny, announcing an open season for westward expansion toward the Pacific Ocean. While President Thomas Jefferson negotiated the 828,000 square mile Louisiana Purchase from Napoleonic France, an additional 525,000 square miles was added by force after the United States victory in the Mexican-American War of 1846, leading then Secretary of the Navy Theodore Roosevelt to proclaim at the onset of hostilities that I should welcome almost any war, for I think this country needs one. While others, like Senator Sam Houston of Texas, proposed the annexation of Mexico, Costa Rica, Guatemala, Honduras, and San Salvador, such expansionist sentiment was put into action by physician, lawyer, journalist, and mercenary William Walker, who launched a privately funded occupation of Nicaragua in 1855, until he and his paid mercenaries were ejected from the country by a coalition of Central American armies. But perhaps the biggest proponent of new imperialism was President Theodore Roosevelt and his big stick corollary to the Monroe Doctrine, where he successfully acquired or annexed Spain's remaining island colonies of Puerto Rico, Cuba, Guam, the Philippines, and Hawaii, following the brief yet decisive American victory in the Spanish-American War of 1898. While late 19th century American imperialism was met with criticism by many at the time, American politicians justified foreign land grabs as protecting and expanding markets for American products, at the same time spreading the virtues of American democratic governance and Christian values. The period was also seen as a natural offshoot of what historian John Fiske called Anglo-Saxon racial superiority, or what Rudyard Kipling poetically called the white man's burden, all the while supported by America's open embrace of social Darwinism and manifest destiny. New imperialism and the white man's burden. After the Suez Canal opened in 1869, the shortcut around Africa set off a wave of colonial expansionism that exploded around the world until its abrupt end in 1914 after the start of World War I. Spurred on by European nations in the United States seeking raw materials and fresh export markets for their Industrial Revolution era products, breakthroughs in medicine, communication, and transportation inspired strong nation-states to exert control over much of Africa, Asia, and Polynesia. Now known as New Imperialism, famed British poet Rudyard Kipling penned a satirical 7-stanza poem entitled The White Man's Burden, in response to America's annexation of the Philippines and Guam, following their victory over Spain during the 3-month Spanish-American War of 1898, which in turn led to the Philippine-American War of 1899, when Filipinos resisted the forced takeover of their sovereign nation. As an imperialist poet, Kipling's poem encouraged Americans to take up the noble cause of empire building, at the same time warning readers about the high cost in money and lives incurred in the process of building empires abroad. American imperialist leaders, in turn, used the jingoistic phrase "white man's burden" as justification for foreign colonization, cobbling the term into a mission statement of sorts, intended to raise up the uncivilized black or brown peoples of the world, which made for a natural extension of the early 19th century philosophy of manifest destiny. During the New Imperialism era, predominantly white nation-states believed they were morally obliged to civilize the non-white peoples of the earth, encouraging economic, social, and cultural advances through colonization of people they felt were incapable of self-governance. While New Imperialism in truth led to improvements in infrastructure, living standards, and overall development of third world countries, the period also witnessed a high volume of atrocities committed by European and American overlords that in many ways negated the moral justifications of imperialism, including brutal acts in the Belgian Congo, where an estimated 8 million natives died between 1885 and 1908, while neighboring French Congo introduced brutal labor practices and the introduction of foreign diseases that wiped out 50% of the indigenous population, making New Imperialism and the white man's burden a period of nationalistic land grabs by white racists everywhere. The Age of Imperialism in China. After Qing dynasty leaders attempted to limit Western influence by establishing the Canton system, which forced all foreign merchants to trade only in the port of Canton, now known as Guangzhou. During the Age of Imperialism, such restrictions resulted in rising tension between China and her oftentimes bullying trading partners from Britain, France, Russia, Germany, and Japan. During imperialism's peak in the 19th century, Britain in particular traded heavily in China for the much coveted commodities of tea, silk, and porcelain. But since the British lacked sufficient silver to effect purely monetary transactions, they traded heavily in opium instead, creating generations of addicted Chinese, while ushering in long periods of civil unrest in Chinese society. China's pushback against the British resulted in the First Opium War of 1839 to 1842 and the Second Opium War of 1856 to 1860, two back-to-back losses for China that led to the unequal treaties that opened up further trading rights for Western powers, as well as rising foreign influence in the once isolationist nation. China's weakening hand saw the rise of outside spheres of influence in China after the mid-1800s, allowing the Russians to take control of a large portion of northern China, while the Japanese severed Chinese dominance over Korea, which led to yet another crushing defeat for the Qing dynasty in the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894 to 1895, which forced China to hand over control of Korea the island of Taiwan, and the Liaodong Peninsula. For its part, while the United States made no regional claims into China, they insisted on an open-door policy, which called for equal access to trade in China for all nations involved. After centuries of Western influence in China, a wave of nationalism arose near the end of the 19th century, leading to the Boxer Rebellion of 1899 to 1901, which sought to end Western imperialism in China, as well as the ousting of Christian missionaries from their land. As the rebellion spread, Qing Empress Dowager Cixi declared war on all foreign nations with diplomatic ties to China, leading to an 8-nation force of some 20,000 troops who crushed the rebellion in 1901. In keeping with China's bad luck pushback against foreign invaders, China signed the Boxer Protocol on September 7th of that same year, which saw the destruction of military fortifications surrounding Beijing, a 2-year prohibition on arms imports, and a payment of $330 million in reparations to the foreign powers that ended the rebellion, making imperialism in China a symbiotic yet unwanted remnant in near Chinese history. The Scramble for Africa. Due to high infectious disease rates and the fear of the unknown, by the late 1870s, Europeans controlled less than 10% of the African continent, limited mostly to coastal regions. Portugal possessed the most important holdings in Angola and Mozambique, with Great Britain holding the Cape Colony, while the French had a foothold in Algeria. That dynamic would shift dramatically between 1881 to the outbreak of World War I in 1914, in what historians now call the New Imperialism, or the Scramble for Africa, which saw 90% of the continent controlled by 7 European powers. The scramble by Europeans seeking raw materials and fresh export markets erupted into a land-grab free-for-all during a time when breakthroughs in medicine, communication, and transportation made the colonization of Africa much more attainable, leading to the Berlin Conference or Congo Conference of 1884. Organized by Otto von Bismarck, the first chancellor of a unified Germany, the primary purpose of the conference was to prevent wars between European powers competing for African lands. And while many improvements to African infrastructure, living standards, and overall development can be cited during the period, the high volume of atrocities committed by European overlords in many ways negates the appearance of progress on the continent, including brutal acts in the Belgian Congo, where an estimated 8 million natives died between 1885 and 1908, while neighboring French Congo introduced brutal labor methods and foreign diseases that wiped out 50% of the indigenous population. During the New Imperialism period in Africa, the nations of Spain, Britain, France, Belgium, Portugal, Germany, and Italy added nearly 9 million square miles to their colonial empires, 1/5 of the world's usable land area. Many uprisings and independence movements dotted the New Imperialism age, including the Moroccan Crisis, the Agadir Crisis, the Fashoda Incident, the Herero Wars, the Maji-Maji Rebellion, and the Dervish Resistance. The period ended with the onset of the First World War, when Europe's focus shifted rapidly from colonial expansion to the fight against German aggression. Teddy Roosevelt and the River of Doubt. 4 years after America's 26th president left office, a man averse to idle vacations, Teddy Roosevelt and his son Kermit embarked on a perilous journey down the Amazon's uncharted Rio da Duvida, or River of Doubt, an adventure that nearly cost the 55-year-old ex-president his life. Whether herding cattle on his ranch in the Dakotas, or hunting cougar in Arizona, even spending a year on safari in Africa, All of Roosevelt's pursuits came with high levels of hardship and risk, two components which he once famously termed as the strenuous life. Calling the trip his last chance to be a boy, the two Roosevelts set out with veteran Brazilian explorer Colonel Candido Rondon, and when the head of the American Museum of Natural History attempted to warn Roosevelt of the dangers that lay ahead, Roosevelt replied, "If it is necessary for me to leave my bones in South America, I am quite ready to do so." After completing a lecture tour of South America, in late 1913, Roosevelt and Rondon set out with a small army of porters, scientists, and explorers, traveling by steamship to the remote Brazilian town of Tapirapoan, before embarking on a 2-month overland journey to the River of Doubt. Reaching the river in February of 1914, 22 intrepid explorers began their treacherous descent of the uncharted river, despite constant attacks by snakes, alligators, piranhas, hostile indigenous people, mosquitoes, and stinging flies. Slowed by repeated waterfalls on the river, the team of explorers were forced to either run the rapids or portage their dugout canoes overland. But when Roosevelt's 23-year-old son decided to run one particularly dangerous rapids on March 15th, Kermit's canoe was sucked into a hydraulic before plunging over a waterfall, taking the life of a Brazilian named Simplicio. Stalked by hostile natives and plagued by malaria, dysentery, and a troubling lack of supplies, Roosevelt fell ill to malaria before slicing his leg open on a rock. Reaching a low point in early April, after a porter named Julio shot and killed another man who had caught him stealing food. When the team failed to capture the murderer, they simply abandoned him to certain death in the jungle. Their clothes reduced to rags, Roosevelt weakened badly as the party survived on fish and hearts of palm. Losing a fourth of his body weight and now delirious with fever and infection, Roosevelt repeatedly implored the team to leave him behind to die. But Kermit would have no part of that, rowing his father to civilization on April 26, 1914, after a 2-month journey that left every man thankful to be alive, making Teddy Roosevelt's trip down the River of Doubt a life-altering adventure for the record books. Wilsonianism. As the horrors of World War I approached its final months of bloody conflict, taking the lives of some 40 million people, on January 8, 1918, President Woodrow Wilson outlined his now famous 14 points as a basis for ending the war while promoting world peace for future generations. Woven into his 14 points was a call for democracy instead of authoritarian rule, the later, Wilson believed, contributing greatly to the outbreak of the First World War. He also called for conflict resolution bodies such as the League of Nations and the United Nations, as well as an emphasis on the spread of capitalism and self-determination among nation-states. Wilson also called for collective security by means of a new sense of liberal internationalism instead of isolationism, including freedom of the seas, open borders, and an end to secret treaties between nations. In his own words, Wilson advocated for the General Association of Nations for the purpose of affording mutual guarantees of political independence and territorial integrity to great and small states alike, and in a later speech to Congress, that national aspirations must be respected while allowing people around the world to be governed by their own consent. Wilson's 14 points launched an intense wave of optimism within colonial-ruled nations in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, elevating Wilson to an almost godlike figurehead in colonial-ruled states around the world, prompting Indian nationalist Ganesh Shankar Vidyarthi to hail Wilson as the modern apostle of freedom. Optimism within colonial-ruled nations proved short-lived, however, when the June 28, 1919 signing of the Treaty of Versailles failed to end colonial rule of first world countries over third world nations, descending citizens of marginalized countries into a communal state of disillusionment and continued despair. Some historians have suggested that not only did the punitive demands the treaty placed on Germany lead directly to the Second World War, but the treaty's complete rejection of Wilsonianism, as Wilson's 14 points are known today, led to a number of protest movements in colonial-ruled nations, including the Egyptian Revolution of 1919, Mahatma Gandhi's passive resistance movement in India, the March 1st movement in Korea, and China's 1919 May 4th movement, making Woodrow Wilson's 14 points a telling missed opportunity for world peace.